The morning sun blazed down on the flight deck of the Imperial Japanese Navy's Akagi. It was June 4th, 1942. The time read 10:22 a.m. The massive carrier cut through Pacific waters 325 nautical miles northwest of Midway Atoll. Lieutenant Joichi Tominaga clutched his flight roster. His hands wouldn't stop shaking. The bombing run over Midway still coursed through his veins like electricity. His fingers gripped the paper so tightly the edges crumpled. Through the thick glass of the carrier's bridge windows, chaos unfolded below him in precise military fashion. Type 99 dive bombers rolled across the deck on their wheels. Ground crews pushed and pulled them into new positions. Type 97 torpedo planes sat motionless as mechanics worked frantically underneath. Their deadly fish were being removed. Heavy 800-kilogram bombs would take their place. Fuel hoses writhed across the wooden deck, planking like massive steel serpents. They connected aircraft to underground tanks, filled with aviation gasoline. The smell of fuel vapor hung in the warm air. In Tominaga's breast pocket, a letter to his wife waited unfinished. Its last line haunted him now. The Americans are nowhere to be found. Victory is certain. Those words felt like prophecy in reverse. He had written them with absolute confidence. The Imperial Navy had never lost a carrier battle. They had never even come close to losing. But something felt different today. Something he couldn't name or explain. What Tominaga couldn't know would terrify him. At this exact moment, American aircraft were already airborne. They were converging on his position from 3 different carriers. Their engines roared through empty sky. Their pilots had one mission: sink the Japanese carriers or die trying. The next 11 minutes would determine everything. Not just the fate of 4 Japanese carriers, not just the outcome of this single battle. These 11 minutes would decide the entire trajectory of the Pacific War. The course of world history itself hung in the balance. Everything the Imperial Japanese Navy believed was about to shatter. Their theories about carrier warfare would prove wrong. Their assumptions about American capabilities were fantasies. Their sense of invincibility would die in flames. All of this would happen in the time it takes to drink a cup of tea. Below Tominaga, on the bustling flight deck, another man worked with desperate efficiency. Aviation machinist, Petty Officer First Class Konami Harada supervised the weapons changeover. Admiral Nagumo had ordered this switch just minutes before. Land attack weapons out, ship attack weapons in. Then back to land attack again. They had trained for this procedure countless times. Switching ordnance was standard carrier doctrine, but never under such pressure. Never with scout planes reporting conflicting information. Never with radio messages that made no sense. Never with this strange feeling that something was terribly wrong. All evidence pointed to Japanese superiority. Their pilots were veterans. Their aircraft were superior. Their tactics had never failed. Yet something felt off, like a musical note played slightly sharp, barely noticeable, but deeply unsettling. At 10:20 a.m., the Japanese carriers had ruled the Pacific. Their aircraft were preparing to destroy what they believed was a single American carrier. The enemy was outnumbered, outgunned, outclassed in every measurable way. Victory was mathematical certainty. By 10:31 a.m., 3 of the 4 carriers would be dying. Burning steel coffins created by American dive bombers. These planes would seem to materialize from empty sky like vengeful spirits. Those 11 minutes would reveal truths about modern naval warfare. Truths that neither navy understood until they unfolded in real time. The endless blue canvas of the Pacific would witness transformation. Not just of ships into wreckage, but of assumptions into reality, of confidence into terror, of certain victory into crushing defeat. The mathematics of Japanese naval superiority appeared unbreakable on June 4, 1942. Numbers don't lie. Statistics tell clear stories. Admiral Chuichi Nagumo commanded the Kido Butai. This was the most powerful carrier striking force ever assembled by any nation in history. 4 fleet carriers formed the backbone of his force. Akagi, the flagship. Kaga, the converted battleship. Soryu, built for speed and aircraft capacity. Hiryu, the newest and most advanced. Together they carried 248 aircraft. Every plane was flown by combat veterans. These weren't green recruits fresh from training. These were the men who had struck Pearl Harbor. They had raided the Indian Ocean with impunity. They had bombed Darwin into rubble. They had attacked Doolittle's carriers near Japan itself. In 6 months of war, they had sunk more Allied warships than the Imperial Navy had destroyed in all previous conflicts combined. Against this veteran force, Admiral Chester Nimitz had positioned 3 carriers: Enterprise, the veteran; Hornet, the newest; Yorktown, hastily repaired from damage that should have taken 3 months to fix. American shipyard workers at Pearl Harbor had performed a miracle. 400 men working around the clock, 72 hours of continuous welding, hammering, and rebuilding. They had made Yorktown barely seaworthy through sheer determination. The Americans fielded 233 aircraft total. Most pilots had never seen combat. Many had fewer than 300 hours total flight time. Some had learned to fly just months before. The torpedo bomber squadrons flew the TBD Devastator. This aircraft was so obsolete that pilots had nicknamed it the TBD Dead. The name wasn't meant as humor. Captain Taijiro Aoki of the Akagi had written confidently in his war diary the night before, "The American Navy is a broken force. After today, they will have no carriers in the Pacific. The war will effectively be over." His confidence wasn't mere bravado. It was based on solid evidence and recent victories. The Japanese had won every carrier engagement of the war so far. At the Battle of the Coral Sea 1 month earlier, they had faced American carriers for the first time. The result seemed to confirm their superiority. They had sunk USS Lexington, America's second-largest carrier. In return, they had lost only the light carrier Shoho. The exchange rate favored Japan dramatically. 1 light carrier for 1 fleet carrier. By that arithmetic, Japan would run out of American targets long before America could threaten Japanese supremacy. They had raided Darwin with complete impunity. The Australians couldn't even mount effective resistance. They had struck Ceylon without facing serious opposition. British carriers had fled rather than fight. From Hawaii to the Indian Ocean, Japanese carriers operated freely. They went where they pleased. They struck what they chose. They withdrew at their convenience. No Allied force had even damaged a Japanese fleet carrier. The streak seemed unbreakable. What the Japanese didn't know on that bright morning would fill encyclopedias. Critical intelligence gaps that would prove fatal. Assumptions that were completely wrong. Beliefs that had no basis in reality. They didn't know that American cryptanalysts at Station Hypo in Pearl Harbor had achieved the impossible. The JN-25 Naval Code had been broken. Not partially. Not approximately. Completely and accurately. Admiral Nimitz could read Japanese operational orders as easily as his morning newspaper. He knew their target was Midway. He knew the composition of their force down to individual ship names. He knew their planned route of approach. He knew their timing within hours. Most critically, he had positioned his carriers in ambush at Point Luck, 325 miles northeast of Midway. The Japanese were sailing into a trap they couldn't see. Lieutenant Yoshio Shiga, a veteran Zero pilot aboard Kaga, would later reflect on their blindness. We operated under the assumption that surprise was entirely ours. We believed the Americans thought we were coming for Hawaii, or perhaps the Aleutians. We believed they had at most one operational carrier in the Pacific. Every single assumption was completely wrong. But we didn't know we were wrong until the bombs were actually falling on our decks. Commander Minoru Genda lay ill in his cabin aboard Akagi. The tactical genius who had planned Pearl Harbor was fighting pneumonia instead of directing this battle. His absence from the bridge would prove more critical than anyone imagined. Genda alone among Japanese commanders had advocated for maintaining a permanent reserve of aircraft armed for anti-ship operations. His paranoia about American carriers had seemed excessive to his colleagues. His substitute, Commander Tamatsu Oishi, lacked both Genda's intuition and his deep suspicion of enemy capabilities. Oishi was competent, but conventional. He followed doctrine rather than instinct. On this day, instinct would matter more than doctrine. The Japanese also didn't know that Yorktown was operational. Their naval intelligence had confirmed she had been heavily damaged at Coral Sea. This intelligence was accurate. They had estimated 3 months minimum for repairs. This estimate would have been correct for any Japanese shipyard. Their own repair capabilities were methodical and thorough. They couldn't conceive that American workers operated differently. That Pearl Harbor shipyard crews had worked continuously while Yorktown was underway. That welders had repaired her hull while she sailed toward battle. That her aircraft elevators had been fixed while she steamed at flank speed. American industrial improvisation was beyond Japanese imagination. At 4:30 a.m. on June 4th, Admiral Nagumo had launched his reconnaissance aircraft. 7 scout planes to search for American ships in the waters around Midway. This was already a dangerous compromise. Naval doctrine called for dozens of scouts, overlapping search patterns, complete coverage of all approaches. But Nagumo wanted to preserve his aircraft for the strike on Midway. Each scout would fly a single search line out 300 miles and back. This left vast areas of ocean completely unsearched. Empty zones where entire fleets could hide undetected. The most critical search line, number 4, was assigned to the heavy cruiser Tone. Mechanical problems delayed Tone's catapult launch by 30 minutes. This single mechanical failure would cascade into disaster. It would place Tone's scout plane over the American fleet at exactly the worst possible moment for the Japanese, when their flight decks were crowded with aircraft being rearmed and refueled, when they were most vulnerable to attack. Petty Officer First Class Amari, a scout plane observer from battleship Haruna, later testified about their systematic blindness. "We flew our assigned search line seeing nothing but empty ocean. Blue water stretching to every horizon. We were trained to see what we expected to see. A merchant ship might be reported as a cruiser. A whale might become a submarine. But nobody was looking for American carriers. Nobody believed American carriers were anywhere in the area." At 4:30 a.m., while darkness still covered the Pacific, 108 Japanese aircraft had launched for the strike on Midway. The formation was perfectly balanced according to doctrine. 36 Zero fighters for air superiority, 36 Val dive bombers for precision strikes, 36 Kate torpedo bombers carrying bombs instead of torpedoes for area destruction. Lieutenant Joichi Tomonaga led this strike force. His aircraft carried the radio that would soon transmit a message. This message would trigger the chain of fatal decisions that followed. His voice would doom his own fleet through accurate battle damage assessment. The Midway strike force encountered fierce resistance over the target. American fighters were waiting at altitude. Obsolete Brewster Buffaloes and Grumman Wildcats rose to meet them. Radar had provided advance warning. The defenders were ready and positioned for maximum effect. Anti-aircraft fire erupted from every installation on the island. Marines manning their guns with desperate accuracy. The sky filled with black puffs of explosive shells. Tracer bullets drew bright lines through the air. The Japanese lost 11 aircraft outright. 14 more were heavily damaged and barely limping home. More importantly, for the larger battle, Tominaga radioed his assessment at 700 a.m. There is need for a second attack wave. Midway's defenses remained intact. Its airfields could still launch aircraft. Its installations could still support operations. One strike wasn't enough. This message arrived just as Admiral Nagumo faced the most crucial decision of his career. He had held 93 aircraft in reserve aboard his carriers. These were torpedo planes armed with deadly ship-killing torpedoes. Dive bombers loaded with armor-piercing bombs designed to penetrate carrier decks. American B-17 flying fortresses from Midway were bombing his fleet from high altitude. Their attacks were ineffective, but forced constant evasive maneuvering. Torpedo bombers from Midway had just completed their attack runs. Also ineffective, but they demonstrated that Midway retained significant offensive capability. Commander Ryosaku Yanagimoto of Soryu argued for maintaining the anti-ship armament. "Sir, we should keep the reserve armed for ship attack. We have heard nothing definitive from our scouts. That doesn't mean there are no American ships in the area." His voice carried urgency and conviction. But Nagumo was under intense pressure. Midway kept launching attacks. His own strike force needed immediate support. Tominaga's message demanded response. At 7:15 a.m., he made his fateful decision. Remove torpedoes from all aircraft. Load bombs for land attack. Prepare for second strike on Midway immediately. What followed was controlled chaos that would prove absolutely fatal. Each Type 97 Kate torpedo bomber carried either one Type 91 torpedo or one 800-kilogram land attack bomb. The weapons were completely different. Different mounting points, different electrical connections, different release mechanisms. Switching between them required complex procedures. Roll each aircraft to the hangar deck via elevator. Remove the torpedo using special handling carriages. Mount the bomb using different attachment points. Adjust the release mechanism for different ballistics. Test all electrical connections. Return the aircraft to the flight deck. Refuel for the different mission profile. Aviation Ordnance Man 2nd Class Tokeshi Maeda, aboard Kaga, later described the frantic scene below decks. "We worked like demons possessed by fury. Torpedoes were stacked everywhere on the hangar deck. Returning them to the magazines took too much precious time. Fuel hoses snaked everywhere across the deck. We were refueling aircraft while changing weapons. This was strictly forbidden by every safety regulation, but it was necessary to save time. The hangar deck became a floating bomb with a lit fuse. But we didn't think about safety. We had performed this drill hundreds of times in training exercises. On Akagi, the situation was even more complex and dangerous. The flagship carried Type 99 dive bombers that could carry different bomb types, either 250-kilogram general-purpose bombs for land targets, or 242-kilogram semi-armor-piercing bombs for ship targets. Each bomb type required different fuses, different mounting brackets, different electrical connections. Ordnance crews had to not only change bombs, but change bomb types entirely. Each weapon system required different handling procedures. The complexity multiplied the time required exponentially. Safety protocols were abandoned in the rush to meet the Admiral's timeline. At 7:28 a.m., As this frantic rearming operation continued throughout the fleet, Tone's delayed scout plane finally reached its assigned turn point. Pilot Petty Officer First Class Hiroshi Amari was about to begin his return flight when white wakes appeared on the distant horizon. Ship wakes, cutting through the blue Pacific waters. His radioed report back to the fleet was frustratingly vague. Sight what appears to be 10 enemy surface ships, bearing 010 degrees from Midway, distance 240 miles, course 150 degrees, speed over 20 knots. The message provided almost no useful tactical information. Admiral Nagumo received this transmission at 7:40 a.m. 10 ships could mean almost anything. Destroyers escorting supply convoys, transport ships carrying reinforcements, cruisers on patrol missions. Nothing that required urgent attention from his precious carrier aircraft. He continued the rearming operation for land attack, but he ordered the scout to investigate further. Ascertain ship types immediately. Maintain contact at all costs. At 7:55 a.m., Nagumo received another message from the distant scout plane. This one seemed to provide relief. Enemy ships are 5 cruisers and 5 destroyers. No carriers visible. The bridge of Akagi erupted in quiet satisfaction. Cruisers and destroyers without air cover would be excellent hunting. Easy targets for his veteran pilots. Some officers even celebrated prematurely. Catching an American surface force without fighter protection would be like target practice. The rearming operation could continue without interruption. Second strike on Midway remained the priority mission. But at 8:09 a.m., another message arrived from Tone's scout plane. This one corrected the previous report with information that changed everything instantly. Enemy force accompanied by what appears to be one carrier bringing up the rear. 5 simple words that shattered Japanese confidence completely. The bridge of Akagi erupted in barely controlled panic. A carrier changed every calculation. Even one carrier posed mortal threat to the entire Japanese fleet. Within seconds, Nagumo issued completely new orders. Suspend all rearming operations immediately. Leave torpedoes on aircraft that still have them. Prepare to launch anti-ship strike immediately. But the situation below decks had passed the point of safe return. Half the aircraft had bombs attached, but not properly fused. Others had torpedoes partially mounted, but not secured. Some aircraft sat on the flight deck with land attack bombs. Others remained in hangars with ship attack torpedoes. To launch a proper coordinated strike, all aircraft needed identical armament. They needed at least 45 minutes to either complete the bomb conversion or return everything to torpedo configuration. Time they didn't have. The situation was actually worse than anyone realized. The returning Midway strike force was now approaching the carriers. Many aircraft were low on fuel. Several were damaged and barely airworthy. All needed to land immediately or risk crashing into the ocean. Imperial Navy doctrine was absolutely inflexible on this point. You recovered your own aircraft first. Then you launched new strikes. To do otherwise meant losing dozens of aircraft and their irreplaceable veteran pilots. Pilots were harder to replace than ships. At 8:30 a.m., Nagumo made his second fatal decision of the morning. We will recover the Midway strike force first. Then we will deal with the American carrier properly. The decision was doctrinally correct. It was also strategically disastrous. From 8:37 a.m. to 9:17 a.m., all 4 Japanese carriers focused entirely on aircraft recovery operations. This procedure was complex, even under ideal circumstances. Clear the flight deck of all spotted aircraft. Turn the formation into the wind. Recover aircraft in precise sequence. Damaged aircraft landed first. Fighters with lowest fuel came next. Bombers landed last. Strike damaged aircraft below immediately to clear precious deck space. Refuel and rearm recovered aircraft according to new mission requirements. Spot fresh aircraft for the next launch. The entire process required perfect timing and coordination. What the Japanese didn't know was that time had already run out completely. At 7:02 a.m., Admiral Raymond Spruance aboard Enterprise had made the most important decision of his naval career. Launch everything immediately at maximum range. Don't wait to coordinate a proper strike package. His Air Operations Officer, Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, had protested vigorously. "Admiral, we'll be launching at extreme range. Many planes won't have enough fuel to make it back to the carriers. The fuel calculations don't add up for a round trip." Spruance's reply would prove prophetic. "We may lose planes to fuel starvation. But if we catch them recovering their midway strike force, we'll catch them at their most vulnerable moment, when their decks are crowded and their fighters are on the ground." The American carrier launch between 7:02 and 8:06 a.m. was barely controlled chaos. It would have horrified Japanese naval aviation instructors. Instead of a coordinated strike package with fighters, dive bombers, and torpedo bombers arriving simultaneously, each squadron launched as soon as it was ready. They proceeded independently toward the target. No coordination, no mutual support, no unified tactical plan. From Enterprise came 33 SBD Dauntless dive bombers in 2 separate squadrons, 14 TBD Devastator torpedo bombers, 10 F-4F Wildcat fighters for escort. From Hornet launched 35 SBD Dauntless dive bombers, 15 TBD Devastator torpedo bombers, 10 F-4F Wildcat fighters. From Yorktown, launching 2 hours later due to her delayed position, came 17 SBD Dauntless dive bombers, 12 TBD Devastator torpedo bombers, 6 F-4F Wildcat fighters. The launch was a complete disaster by Japanese standards of precision. Squadrons became separated immediately after takeoff. Fighters flew at different altitudes from the bombers they were supposed to protect. Radio discipline collapsed entirely. Navigation errors sent entire squadrons in completely wrong directions. Hornet's fighters and dive bombers never found the Japanese fleet at all. They flew past the target area entirely. Most ran out of fuel and ditched in the ocean. Others returned to their carrier having accomplished nothing. The coordination was so poor it seemed almost comical. Ensign George Gay, a torpedo bomber pilot from Hornet's VT-8 squadron, later described the desperate scene. "We launched knowing we probably wouldn't make it back alive. Our squadron commander, Lieutenant Commander John Waldron, told us straight. We're going in alone. We'll probably all be killed. But we're going to hit those carriers no matter what it costs us." We flew off separately from our fighters and dive bombers. It was pure suicide by any tactical measure, but it was also our job. We had trained for this moment. We knew the odds. We went anyway. At 9:18 a.m., just as the last Japanese aircraft from the Midway strike touched down safely, radar operators aboard Soryu detected incoming aircraft, low on the water, flying directly toward the fleet. Lieutenant Commander John Waldron's VT-8 squadron had found the Japanese carriers through brilliant navigation and absolute determination. 15 obsolete TBD Devastator torpedo bombers. No fighter escort, no dive bomber support, flying straight into the teeth of the most powerful carrier fleet ever assembled. The massacre that followed was swift and complete. All 15 Devastators were shot down by Zero fighters and anti-aircraft fire. 29 of 30 aircrew were killed instantly. Only Ensign George Gay survived. He hid under his seat cushion in the warm Pacific water. From there, he watched what happened next. Not a single American torpedo found its target. The attack appeared completely futile, a useless waste of brave men and obsolete aircraft. But the sacrifice had achieved something crucial that nobody recognized at the time. The defending Zero fighters had all descended to sea level to attack the torpedo bombers. The Japanese carriers had been forced into violent evasive maneuvers. They couldn't spot aircraft for launch while dodging torpedoes. Most critically, the attention of every Japanese lookout was focused downward at the water level. Nobody was scanning the sky above. At 9:36 a.m., Enterprise's VT-6 squadron arrived over the target. 14 more TBD Devastator torpedo bombers, also without fighter escort, also flying obsolete aircraft against impossible odds. They too were systematically massacred. 10 of 14 aircraft were shot down. Again, no torpedo hits were achieved. At 1000 a.m., Yorktown's VT-3 squadron completed the trilogy of sacrifice. 12 more torpedo bombers with only a handful of fighter escorts. They lost 10 of 12 aircraft. Once again, no torpedoes found their targets. The slaughter seemed pointless and complete. At 10:20 a.m., the last American torpedo bomber was either destroyed or fleeing toward home. The Japanese carriers began recovering their Zero fighters. The interceptors were now low on ammunition from the sustained combat. They needed fuel and fresh ammunition loads. Victory seemed absolutely complete and final. Not a single torpedo hit on any Japanese ship. 35 of 41 American torpedo bombers had been destroyed. The enemy's primary strike capability was eliminated. The threat was over. On the bridge of Akagi, Admiral Nagamo finally allowed himself to relax completely. The tension drained from his shoulders. His operations officer reported with satisfaction. "Sir, we can be ready to launch our anti-ship strike in 30 minutes. All aircraft will be armed with torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs." The flight decks of all 4 carriers were now packed with aircraft like floating parking lots. Akagi had 40 aircraft spotted on deck, all fueled and armed for the mission. Kaga carried 30 planes ready for launch. Soryu had 33 aircraft prepared. Hiryu, positioned further north, carried 38 planes ready to strike. Fuel hoses were still connected to many aircraft. Ordnance crews made final adjustments to bomb fuses and torpedo settings. Pilots climbed into their cockpits. Engines coughed to life and began warming up. The sound of propellers filled the air. Victory was 30 minutes away. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey's Enterprise dive bombers had been flying in expanding search circles. They were looking for the Japanese fleet that wasn't where intelligence had predicted. Fuel gauges showed dangerous levels. Many pilots were already calculating whether they had enough gas to return home. McCluskey had to make a critical decision: continue searching or head home immediately. Then he spotted a single Japanese destroyer racing northeast at high speed. The ship was making a white wake in the blue water. McCluskey made an inspired guess: follow that destroyer. It must be rejoining the main fleet. That guess led him directly over the Japanese carriers at exactly their most vulnerable moment. At 10:22 a.m., McCluskey's 33 SBD Dauntless dive bombers pushed over into their attack dives. They rolled inverted and pointed their noses straight down toward the target from 14,500 feet altitude. The defending Zero fighters were all at sea level. They were refueling and rearming after the torpedo bomber massacres. The anti-aircraft guns were trained horizontally for low-level torpedo defense. Nobody expected an attack from high altitude. The flight decks were covered with aircraft, fuel lines, and ordnance. Everything needed to create catastrophic secondary explosions. Lieutenant Richard Best, leading Bombing Squadron 6, selected Akagi as his primary target. In his detailed after-action report, he wrote with clinical precision, The carrier was turning into the wind for aircraft launch. Her entire flight deck was packed solid with aircraft. I could see crew members running across the deck in obvious panic. Fuel hoses were being frantically disconnected. Aircraft engines were trying to start. They had maybe 60 seconds of warning, not nearly enough time to save themselves. At 10:26 a.m., Best's 1,000-pound bomb penetrated Akagi's flight deck near the midship elevator. It punched through the wooden planking like paper. The bomb exploded deep in the hangar deck among stacked torpedoes and bombs. These weapons had been removed from aircraft during the rearming operation. They had been stored against every safety regulation. The explosion triggered massive secondary detonations. Torpedoes exploded in sequence. Bombs added their fury to the firestorm. Aviation gasoline ignited in a roaring inferno. The flagship of the Kido Butai was mortally wounded in seconds. Simultaneously, Lieutenant Earl Gallagher's squadron dove on Kaga like hawks attacking prey. 4 1,000-pound bombs hit the massive converted battleship in less than 30 seconds. Perfect bombing accuracy under combat conditions. The first bomb hit the forward flight deck. It destroyed the bridge instantly, killing Captain Jisaku Okada and his entire command staff. The subsequent bombs hit among the packed aircraft on deck. Each explosion triggered others. The 80,000 gallons of aviation fuel aboard Kaga began burning immediately. Torpedoes exploded like giant firecrackers. Bombs added their destruction to the growing inferno. Within minutes, the enormous ship was ablaze from bow to stern. The heat became so intense that firefighting crews couldn't approach within 50 feet of the flames. Water turned to steam before it could reach the fire. Lieutenant Commander Max Leslie's Yorktown dive bombers arrived at almost exactly the same moment. They targeted Soryu with the same devastating precision. 3 1,000-pound bombs hit the carrier in a perfect line down her flight deck. Textbook dive bombing technique executed under impossible pressure. The first bomb exploded in the forward hangar deck. The second hit amidships among tightly packed aircraft. The third destroyed the rear elevator completely. Soryu had a particular vulnerability that made the damage even worse. She carried extra aviation fuel tanks along both sides of her hangar deck. These tanks extended her aircraft operational range. When they ruptured, they created an immediate firestorm. Temperatures exceeded 1,000 degrees Celsius. The metal deck plates began to glow red-hot. The ship became a floating furnace. At 10:31 a.m., as suddenly as it had begun, the American dive bomber attack was completely over. McCluskey's aircraft were heading home. Many were running on fuel fumes. Some wouldn't make it back to their carriers. In just 11 minutes of actual combat, 3 of Japan's 4 fleet carriers had been transformed from the most powerful warships afloat into burning, dying hulks. On Akagi's bridge, Admiral Nagumo stood frozen in shock and disbelief. Explosions continued to rock the ship beneath his feet. Each blast sent tremors through the steel deck. His operations officer, Commander Oishi, was shouting damage reports that seemed impossible to believe. Flight deck completely destroyed. Hangar deck engulfed in flames. All spotted aircraft lost. Steering control completely lost. Communications equipment destroyed. Water mains ruptured. Firefighting systems inoperative. The flagship was dying before their eyes. Captain Taijiro Aoki grabbed Nagumo's arm. The admiral seemed paralyzed by the catastrophic reversal of fortune. "Admiral, we must transfer your flag immediately. This ship is lost. There's nothing more we can do here. We must command the remaining forces from Hiryu." On Kaga, the situation was even more desperate and hopeless. With the captain and all senior officers killed instantly in the first bomb hit, command had devolved to junior damage control officers. They were trapped below decks by spreading fires. No coordinated damage control was possible. Soryu was dying fastest of the three carriers. Captain Ryusaku Yanagimoto refused all pleas to abandon his bridge. Flames were approaching his position. The deck beneath his feet was growing hot. He stood at attention, going down with his ship like the samurai tradition demanded. His sacrifice would be remembered. His ship would not be saved. The captain's final command echoed across the burning deck as survivors scrambled for safety. "Save yourselves!" he shouted above the roar of flames. "I will remain with the ship." Witnesses saw him binding himself to the wheel with rope. His resolve was absolute. He would die with his vessel. The clock showed 10:31 in the morning when catastrophe struck the Japanese fleet. Their naval command faced devastation beyond their worst nightmares. 3/4 of their striking power vanished faster than a single aircraft could complete its attack run. Admiral Taman Yamaguchi stood on the deck of Hiryu. She was the only carrier still floating. Black smoke pillars stretched toward the sky from her sister ships. The sight made his stomach turn. The numbers painted a picture of complete disaster. 11 minutes had cost Japan 3 massive carriers. 110 aircraft sat burning on flight decks. Another 40 aircraft were trapped in hangar bays below. 50 more planes circled overhead with nowhere to land. Their fuel gauges showed empty. Eventually, over 2,000 trained airmen and mechanics would die. These were losses Japan could never replace. Scenes aboard the burning carriers defied human imagination. Akagi shuddered as explosions rippled through her hull. Each blast sent steel fragments slicing through packed compartments. Men died in waves as metal shards tore through their bodies. The hangar deck became a furnace. Bodies burned where they fell. Kaga faced even worse horrors. Her massive size meant more compartments filled with trapped sailors. She had been converted from a battleship. Her thick armor now became a prison. Fires raged above while men suffocated below. Bulkheads glowed cherry red from intense heat. Hundreds died locked in steel boxes that became their tombs. Soryu's chief engineer, Commander Kondo, lived through the nightmare in the engine room. The first bomb severed every steam line at once. Superheated steam at 400 degrees filled the spaces instantly. Men were cooked alive in seconds. Others choked as flames consumed all oxygen. The lucky ones died fast. Admiral Yamaguchi faced impossible odds with typical Japanese aggression. One carrier remained against 3 American flat-tops. The mathematics were suicide. He ordered an immediate counterattack anyway. At 10:58 a.m., the strike launched. Only 27 minutes had passed since the American bombs fell. 18 Val dive bombers climbed into the morning sky. 6 Zero fighters escorted them toward the enemy. They found Yorktown at noon exactly. American radar had detected their approach miles away. Fighter planes dove to intercept them. Anti-aircraft guns tracked their every move. The veteran Japanese pilots pressed forward anyway. 3 bombs struck Yorktown's flight deck. Fires erupted across her superstructure. Her boilers took damage, and she slowed to a crawl. Yamaguchi immediately prepared a second strike. His staff protested the futility. He ignored their objections. At 1:31 in the afternoon, 10 Kate torpedo bombers launched. 6 more Zeros provided cover. This tiny force represented Japan's last offensive punch. They found Yorktown again at 2:42 p.m. Half the attackers died approaching their target. The survivors put 2 torpedoes into her port side. Lieutenant Joichi Tominaga led this final desperate attack. His plane had been damaged over Midway that morning. The left wing fuel tank leaked badly. He calculated the fuel remaining. The numbers showed he couldn't make it back to Hiryu. He launched anyway. His torpedo was one of two that hit home. His plane splashed into the Pacific immediately after. The fuel gauge read empty. At 5:03 p.m., the inevitable happened. 24 American dive bombers found Hiryu. They came from Enterprise and the damaged Yorktown. 4 bombs turned the last Japanese carrier into an inferno. Captain Tomeo Kaku lay dying on the bridge. His final order was clear and simple. Scuttle the ship. Save the crew. Admiral Yamaguchi chose to stay aboard his flagship. His last message went to his surviving staff officers. I will apologize to the Emperor for this defeat. You must rebuild the Navy without me. As Japanese carriers burned throughout the afternoon, surviving officers began understanding their intelligence catastrophe. The evidence was overwhelming when examined carefully. American carriers had appeared at precisely the right coordinates. Midway was fully alerted and prepared for attack. Submarines lurked along every Japanese approach route. Strike aircraft launched at maximum range at exactly the perfect moment. Captain Yasuji Watanabe served as operations officer for the combined fleet. He would write later about their realization. We understood that the Americans had read our mail completely. Every message we sent, they intercepted. Every order we issued, they decoded. Every plan we made, they anticipated. We had been performing a play for an audience that already knew every line. The surprise we thought belonged to us actually belonged to them. Beyond the intelligence disaster, the battle exposed fundamental flaws in Japanese carrier doctrine. Their theories about massed carrier operations were actually correct. Coordinated strikes and holding reserves made tactical sense. But they failed to execute these concepts under combat pressure. The moment crisis struck, they abandoned their own principles. The American dive bomber, called the SBD Dauntless, proved superior to the famous Japanese Val. Not in speed or maneuverability, but in the only statistic that mattered: survivability while delivering ordnance on target. American doctrine emphasized deckload strikes rather than hangar storage. This meant faster launch times when speed became crucial. American damage control procedures had been mocked by Japanese officers as overcautious. These same procedures had already saved Yorktown once that morning. They would save dozens of other carriers throughout the war. Japanese damage control relied on individual heroism. American damage control relied on systematic preparation. Night fell on June 4th, with thousands of Japanese sailors floating in the dark Pacific. Others crowded aboard destroyers that had rescued them. The 3 carriers still floated, but only as burning abandoned hulks on the horizon. Many Japanese sailors refused rescue when it was offered. They believed they had failed their emperor completely. Men would swim away from rescue lines thrown to them. They shouted, "May the emperor live 10,000 years," and dove underwater. They held their breath until they drowned rather than accept the shame of survival. This was the warrior code taken to its logical extreme. The Americans didn't know they were winning, even as victory became certain. Admiral Spruance received reports of his missing squadrons throughout the afternoon. His calculations showed over half his aircraft were gone. Yorktown was crippled and listing badly. Japanese submarines were reported in every direction. Spruance's decision to continue the engagement despite massive uncertainty proved crucial. His scouts found the burning Japanese carriers that evening. The reports confirmed the magnitude of American victory. But even then, the Americans didn't fully grasp what they had accomplished in those 11 minutes. June 5th brought cruel confirmation of both American fears and Japanese disaster. The submarine I-168 had been dispatched by Admiral Yamamoto. Lieutenant Commander Yahachi Tanabe found Yorktown under tow. She was barely moving through the water. He fired 4 torpedoes at point-blank range. 2 torpedoes struck Yorktown's damaged hull. 1 hit the destroyer Hammond tied alongside. Yorktown would sink on June 7th, becoming the last carrier lost at Midway. But by then, the strategic outcome was already decided beyond question. The 4 Japanese carriers were gone forever. Their own destroyers scuttled them when salvage proved impossible. The human cost of those 11 minutes continued mounting for days afterward. Akagi was scuttled at 5 a.m. on June 5th. She had burned for 19 straight hours before going under. Kaga sank at 7:25 p.m. on June 4th. She took 811 men with her to the bottom. Soryu went under at 7:13 p.m. on June 4th, with 711 souls aboard. Soryu lingered until 9 a.m. on June 5th, before disappearing beneath the waves. 392 men died with her. The total Japanese death toll from the 4 carriers reached 2,100 but these weren't ordinary sailors or replaceable personnel. They were experienced mechanics who could service complex aircraft engines in minutes. They were armorers who could mount torpedoes with their eyes closed. They were fuel handlers trained in dangerous underway replenishment procedures. Most importantly, they were veteran pilots who had conquered half the Pacific Ocean. Each pilot represented 2 years of intensive training. Each mechanic needed 18 months to become qualified. Flight deck crews required 6 months of drilling to operate efficiently under combat conditions. Admiral Yamamoto sat aboard the battleship Yamato 300 miles behind the carrier force. He received the catastrophic reports in complete silence. His staff officer, Commander Yasuji Watanabe, described the scene decades later. The admiral sat perfectly still for nearly an hour after learning of the 4th carrier's loss. Then he spoke very quietly. "The war is over. We will fight on because we must. But the war is over." Yamamoto understood what others would take months to comprehend fully. Japan had started the war with 10 fleet and light carriers total. In 6 months of fighting, they had lost 5 of them. They could build new carriers, and they would try. But they couldn't replace the trained crews that had died. A qualified carrier pilot required 2 full years of training. A qualified aircraft mechanic needed 18 months of schooling. A flight deck crew needed 6 months of intensive drilling to function efficiently under pressure. The mathematics were absolutely inexorable and completely unforgiving. America launched 17 new carriers by the time Japan managed to commission just 1 replacement. American pilot training programs were producing 10,000 pilots per month by 1943. Japan never exceeded 500 per month and couldn't even replace their losses. The survivors of Midway carried psychological scars that infected the entire Japanese Navy. The myth of Japanese invincibility was completely shattered. The confidence built from operations spanning Pearl Harbor to Ceylon evaporated in 11 minutes of American dive bomber attacks. The Japanese Navy instituted new procedures based on Midway's harsh lessons. Combat air patrol was always retained at altitude. Flight decks were kept clear unless immediately launching aircraft. Ordnance was returned to magazines the instant operations ended. Multiple search patterns provided overlapping coverage. Radio silence was abandoned for tactical communication when necessary. But these changes came too late and addressed symptoms rather than causes. The real cause was that American intelligence, production capacity, and innovation had already surpassed Japan by 1942. The window for Japanese victory had already closed before Midway was even fought. For the Americans, those 11 minutes created a completely different transformation. From desperate defenders, they became confident aggressors overnight. The Pacific Fleet, traumatized by Pearl Harbor, had discovered something remarkable. They could not just fight the Japanese Navy, but actually destroy it completely. Admiral Nimitz received confirmation of the victory at his Pearl Harbor headquarters. He told his staff with quiet satisfaction, "They are not supermen after all. They can be beaten decisively. They have been beaten today. Now we take the offensive and keep it." The tactical lessons were immediately incorporated into American doctrine. Dive bombers were supreme ship killers in the right circumstances. Coordinated strikes were ideal, but not absolutely essential for success. First strike advantage was usually decisive in carrier warfare. Radar-directed fighter control was absolutely crucial for defense. Damage control procedures could save seemingly doomed ships, but the most important lesson was purely psychological in nature. Ensign George Gay was the sole survivor of Hornet's VT-8 squadron. He had floated in the water watching Japanese carriers burn throughout the afternoon. He put the transformation simply in post-war interviews. "We had stood up to the very best they had and destroyed it completely. After that, we knew we would win the war eventually. It was just a matter of time and blood." Post-war analysis revealed the precise sequence of those 11 minutes in devastating detail. American dive bombers had achieved approximately 52% hit rates at Midway. This was far above normal training statistics. They achieved these results at the absolutely perfect moment when Japanese defenses were most vulnerable. The Japanese had shot down 35 of 41 American torpedo bombers. This represented an 85% kill rate. But those sacrificial attacks had created the exact conditions for dive bomber success. The torpedo planes had drawn Japanese fighters down to sea level. The Japanese carriers had been caught in what naval theorists called the vulnerable window. This was the moment when a carrier was most helpless. Aircraft were being serviced, preventing defensive maneuvers. Fuel lines were connected, making fire inevitable. Ordnance was exposed, multiplying any bomb damage. Attention was focused elsewhere, preventing early detection of incoming threats. Commander Joseph Rochefort was the intelligence officer whose code breakers made the ambush possible. He observed years later with characteristic precision, "We won because we knew exactly when they would be most vulnerable. We were lucky enough to catch them at precisely that moment. 5 minutes earlier or later, and the battle probably ends very differently." Today, the wrecks of Japanese carriers lie in Midway's deep waters as war graves for thousands. Oceanographer Robert Ballard's expeditions found Yorktown at 16,650 feet depth. Kaga rests at 17,700 feet on the bottom. Their hulks stand as testimonies to those 11 decisive minutes. Recent expeditions in 2023 provided detailed surveys of these underwater monuments. They are now protected within the Papahānaumokuākea Marine National Monument. The wrecks remain largely intact after 8 decades underwater. Survivors from both sides established memorials and held regular commemorations. At these gatherings, former enemies met as friends. They were united in recognition of a battle that fundamentally changed human history. The shared experience of combat created bonds that transcended nationality. The Japanese Navy's attempt to hide Midway's outcome from their own people backfired completely. They quarantined survivors and swore them to secrecy. They claimed victory in newspapers while hiding the defeat. This pattern of deception corroded morale throughout the fleet. It set a precedent that would continue until the war's end. Historians have endlessly debated how those 11 minutes might have unfolded differently. If Tone's scout plane had launched on schedule, if Nagumo had kept a reserve strike armed and ready, if American torpedo bombers hadn't attacked first, if McCluskey hadn't followed that Japanese destroyer, if wind conditions had been different. But history offers no alternative timelines for consideration. What happened in those 11 minutes changed everything that followed. The consequences rippled outward for decades, affecting millions of lives. Modern military strategists still study Midway for lessons applicable to contemporary conflicts. Information dominance remains absolutely decisive in warfare. First strike advantage in high-technology combat usually determines final outcomes. All military systems have moments of maximum vulnerability that can be exploited. Individual decisions made under extreme pressure still determine strategic outcomes. Better systems consistently defeat better individual warriors. Technology and intelligence matter more than courage and tradition. In letters, diaries, and interviews collected over 8 decades, survivors painted intimate portraits of those 11 minutes. American and Japanese accounts converge on several common themes. The chaos was beyond description. Individual heroism was remarkable. The terror was overwhelming. The transformation was permanent. The U.S. Naval War College's analysis reaches a stark conclusion. Midway's 11 minutes remain the gold standard for decisive military action in history. Never before or since has such a brief window of time so completely reversed strategic reality between major powers. Economic historians calculate that those 11 minutes cost Japan approximately 2 billion yen in 1942 values. This represented roughly 15% of Japan's total annual military budget. But the indirect costs proved far greater than direct losses. Pilot training programs were accelerated, reducing quality standards. Resources were diverted from other critical projects to replace carriers. Industrial capacity was strained beyond sustainable limits. Technical development was rushed, leading to serious design flaws throughout remaining war production. America conversely found its war economy completely vindicated by Midway's outcome. The carriers lost at Midway were replaced within months by new construction. The industrial machine that had seemed impossible to Japanese observers was just beginning to reach full capacity. In Japanese culture, Midway became a powerful metaphor for nemesis. It represented the moment when hubris inevitably meets reality. The term Midway syndrome entered Japanese business vocabulary. It described overconfidence leading directly to catastrophic failure. Japanese Admiral Tanaka Raizo wrote after the war with brutal honesty. Those 11 minutes taught Japan that the age of the samurai warrior was permanently over. Individual courage, skill, and dedication meant nothing against systematic intelligence, overwhelming production capacity, and technological superiority. We entered those 11 minutes as proud warriors. We emerged as historical anachronisms. Survivors from both sides carried unique psychological burdens for the rest of their lives. American dive bomber pilots who delivered death in those 11 minutes often suffered severe survivor's guilt. Japanese sailors who lived through the infernos faced cultural shame for surviving when their ships died. Lieutenant Richard Best, whose bomb destroyed Kaga, never flew combat again. Tuberculosis was activated by breathing caustic soda from his aircraft's faulty oxygen system. He spent decades wondering about the men he killed with that one perfectly placed bomb. "I did my duty," he said in 1995, "but duty doesn't ease the knowledge that my success meant death for hundreds of men who were also doing their duty." Modern computer simulations have recreated those 11 minutes with precise scientific detail. They reveal how incredibly narrow the margin of victory actually was. If American dive bombers had arrived 5 minutes later, Japanese combat air patrol would have been refueled and at altitude ready to intercept. If they had arrived 10 minutes earlier, Japanese flight decks wouldn't have been packed with vulnerable aircraft. If cloud cover had been 500 feet lower, the dive bombers couldn't have attacked effectively. If wind direction had been different, carriers couldn't have launched or recovered aircraft properly. The simulation's conclusion is startling in its precision. Those 11 minutes represented the only window in a 2-hour period when Japanese carriers were catastrophically vulnerable to attack. The Americans hit that narrow window with perfect timing. Military doctrine worldwide changed fundamentally based on those 11 minutes of combat. Carriers began operating in widely dispersed formations rather than concentrated groups. Combat air patrols maintained multiple altitude layers continuously. Deckload strikes became absolutely standard, minimizing hangar bay exposure. Damage control became equally important as offensive capability. Intelligence gathering received equal priority with combat operations. The U.S. Navy completely rewrote its carrier warfare manual based on Midway's lessons. Every procedure was examined and modified. The Japanese Navy couldn't afford to implement the changes their own analysis recommended. They lacked resources to maintain constant air patrols or rapid rearmament capabilities. Ultimately, those 11 minutes came down to individual human decisions made under extreme pressure. McCluskey's decision to follow the destroyer. Best's split-second choice of targets. Nagumo's fateful order to rearm aircraft. Spruance's calculated risk to launch at maximum range. Individual pilots pressing attacks despite facing certain death. Admiral Spruance reflected years later on the battle's outcome. "We won because our mistakes were recoverable, and theirs were not." In those 11 minutes, every Japanese error was magnified by circumstances. Every American gamble paid off beyond expectations. It wasn't divine justice or manifest destiny. It was probability finally catching up with excessive risk-taking. At the 75th anniversary of Midway in 2017, the last surviving participants spoke at commemorative ceremonies. Their words captured the enormous weight of those 11 minutes that had defined the remainder of the 20th century. History remembers those moments as both glorious victory and necessary horror. They defined not just a single battle, but an entire era of human conflict. They proved that in modern warfare, strategic advantage can shift instantly and irreversibly. They demonstrated that intelligence, technology, and industrial capacity matter more than military tradition, individual training, and tactical superiority. They showed that individual decisions at crucial moments can outweigh years of careful preparation. Between 10:20 and 10:31 a.m. on June 4, 1942, the trajectory of human history shifted dramatically. 3 Japanese carriers representing the pride of the Imperial Navy were transformed into burning wrecks. American aircraft launched in desperate, uncoordinated attacks had achieved what seemed completely impossible. They had won decisive victory against a clearly superior enemy force. Those 11 minutes proved that in modern warfare, advantage can shift instantly and irreversibly between opposing sides. They demonstrated that intelligence, technology, and industrial capacity matter more than tradition, training, and tactical superiority in determining outcomes. They showed that individual decisions at crucial moments can outweigh years of meticulous preparation and planning. Japanese pilots who had ruled Pacific skies for 6 months discovered in 11 minutes that their dominance was an illusion built on temporary advantage. American pilots who had been dismissed as inferior discovered they could destroy the world's best naval force when circumstances aligned properly. In those 11 minutes, 181 Japanese sailors and airmen would eventually die on the 4 burning carriers. They joined 307 Americans in transforming abstract strategic concepts into human tragedy measured in individual lives lost. Their sacrifice, both willing and unwilling, victorious and defeated, created the pivot point around which the entire Pacific War turned. The carriers that sank took with them not just steel and fuel and ammunition. They carried dreams of empire, assumptions of racial superiority, and confidence in manifest destiny. They left behind widows who would never learn how their husbands died. Children would grow up without fathers present. Nations were forced to confront the difference between cherished mythology and harsh reality. Today, the Pacific Ocean flows peacefully over the graves of Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. Yorktown rests nearby in the same dark waters. American and Japanese wrecks share the ocean floor as monuments to those 11 minutes when the future was forged in falling bombs and rising flames, when young men died for causes they believed in completely, when the modern world was born in violence that seemed endless but lasted less time than an ordinary coffee break. Those 11 minutes stand as history's most compressed lesson in the futility of military hubris and the terrible power of intelligence combined with innovation. They remind us that in warfare, as in life, everything can change in mere moments, that superiority is always temporary and fragile, that the price of strategic error is inevitably paid in blood by those who had no voice in making the decisions that doomed them. The last word belongs to Admiral Nagamo, who survived those 11 minutes but never recovered psychologically from them. Before his death on Saipan in 1944, he wrote with bitter clarity, "At Midway, we learned that wars are not won by individual warriors, but by superior systems. In 11 minutes, the American system completely destroyed our warrior tradition. We thought we were fighting the last war better than anyone. They were fighting the next war first." Those 11 minutes were not a battle in any traditional sense. They were an execution of obsolescence by innovation. The American aircraft that launched that morning changed more than just the Pacific War's trajectory. They changed how humanity would fight, think about, and remember military conflict. In those 11 minutes, the age of the warrior ended forever. The age of the technologist began immediately. The world has never been the same since those bombs fell on burning flight decks 80 years ago.